Instead, Carl came back to Medina, North Dakota to become the pastor of the United Church of Christ here. And, you know, I always thought that a lot of people would see that as failure. And one of the reasons for that is because I experienced something somewhat similar. You know, I grew up on the farm here, and then, you know, my father was always insistent that I had to get as much education as I possibly could because he was denied that when he grew up, and so he, you know, typically overreacted. And so there was no question about the fact I had to go to college, and then I went to graduate school, and I started a career in higher education, and ended up finally as, in my first phase of my academic career, as an academic dean at a liberal arts college in Boston, Massachusetts. And then when my father had a mild heart attack, and he announced to the family that he was going to try to find somebody to manage the farm for him, because his doctor said he could still be a farmer, but he couldn't continue to undergo the stress of managing it. That was too much for his heart. And so I, you know, and I was frankly a little bored with academic life, and I thought, well, it'd be kind of interesting to come back and see what we could do about transitioning the farm to an organic farm. And he was very much agreeable to that. And my colleagues at Curry College thought I'd gone crazy, you know, that I would leave an academic career to go to North Dakota to manage a farm. And I think most of my neighbors thought I was kind of crazy. And I think the primary reason for that, because they thought what I was really doing was going from success to failure. And so when Carl made that decision, you know, after a successful career which led him to a pretty prestigious position as a staff member of Byron Dorgan's Senate work, to come back to a small town like Medina, North Dakota to become his pastor, would have, to many people, seen as a sign of going from success to failure. But it really, you know, and I've known Carl for quite a while, and I knew part of the passion that he had in his heart and in his soul, and that his reason for doing that was a reason which was consistent with his values and what he wanted to accomplish with his life. And to a large extent, it's captured in that quote that we just put up on the wall over there, that it's ultimately a community which is the important thing. And I didn't get to hear Carl do as many sermons as I would have liked to, but I can't remember a sermon that he gave in which he didn't include the concept of justice. Justice was always a core issue for him. And justice not in the sense of, you know, you all got to do right and be good, but justice in this sense that it's when a community works together and is together, that everybody benefits, that everybody can have a better life. And so it was one of those signature issues that he contributed, I know, to this community and to all of those who knew him. Now, all of this may seem really strange to a lot of people because for a long time now, a lot of very influential people have already written off rural communities. About 20 years ago, there was a journalist by the name of Margaret Udansky, and she was writing for USA Today newspaper. And she wrote a front page article about the failure of rural communities. And one of the things she said in her quote was that rural communities have a lot of history with little else. And she said that, you know, when Henry Ford manufactured the Model T Ford, he could just as well have driven that Ford through the front store windows of businesses in rural communities, because that was the end of rural communities, because now people could travel, you know, to urban communities, etc., and they would abandon rural communities. And so why are we still even, the point of her article was, why do people even still have any interest or concern about rural communities? And if you think about it, there's a long history that leads to that in this country. And Carl Stauber, who was the president of the Northwest Area Foundation for a number of years, and during the time that he was the president, the Northwest Area Foundation tried to really address some of the issues of rural communities and how rural communities could move toward become more revitalized and serve the people that were a part of it. And in one of his papers, Carl pointed out that rural communities have gone through 3 phases in this country, but each of these 3 phases, never valued rural communities for themselves. They only valued rural communities for what they could contribute to other communities. And the first of those 3 phases, he said that first phase was from the American Revolution until the late 1800s, and what he called the frontier phase. And this was when this country was in the process. You know, had the frontier, and people moved out into the frontier, including North Dakota. And the rural communities in that phase were expected to provide the raw materials for exports, because, so, you know, rural communities produced cotton to export, they produced tobacco to export, and other kinds of crops, etc. Because during that phase, we weren't yet developing our own, we didn't have our own manufacturing capacity developed, so we had to import our manufactured goods, and to fund that, we exported our raw materials, and we expected the rural communities to do that. In other words, rural communities existed in order to serve another economic part of the equation. And then the second phase, he said, which he called the storehouse phase, and this was from the late 1800s until about 1970. And this was this was the time when we were developing our own industrial capacity. And so we needed the raw materials to be transported into our urban communities, so that our urban communities had the raw materials to do this great industrial miracle that everybody talked about. So again, rural communities were not valued for themselves, but they were only valued for the raw materials that they could supply to other parts of the economy. And then Carl Stauber argued that in about 1970, we moved into a third phase, which he identifies as the economies of scale phase. This was a time when economies began to recognize that the way to really be successful is you have to get big. And, you know, all of us who are farmers remember when even our Secretary of Agriculture said, get big or get out, you know, that's your choice. Adapt or die, one of the other Secretaries of Agriculture said. So this is what you had to do. And again, rural communities were not valued in this, because if you get big, and we've seen this happen here in Medina, we've seen it in many of our other rural communities, as everything gets bigger, you no longer need your rural community to supply some of the basic goods and services that you previously had. And so, you know, we're now reaching a point where, and those of us here in North Dakota know this, of course, where some of the basic services that we need in our communities are gradually disappearing. And so it would seem like this is the end of the game, right? And here you had Carl, here in Medina, saying things like, you know, if you put your community's needs before your own, you always win. And that sounds pretty crazy, doesn't it? So, you know, what was he thinking? Well, Carl was a kind of individual who could see beyond all of these things, and could see the value in terms of our lives, and what really are the things that provide value to us. And that was part of his passion, and that was part of his ministry, and the great contribution that he made to this community. Energy costs go up as we have less, you know, less of that cheap energy available. And he's arguing now that by the year 2040, we're going to have 40 to 50 million people engaged in producing our food. Now think about this for a minute. Right now, we have 192,442 farms that produce 75% of our total agricultural commodities. Just 192,442 farms. And here's Richard Heinberg saying by the year 2040, we're going to have 40 to 50 million people producing our food. What's he thinking? Well, what he's thinking is, and we're starting to see this, I'm starting to see this in my association, in my travels, and that is more and more people now, you know, as food costs go up, as energy costs go up, are trying to figure out, well, you know, maybe I should do some of this on my own. Maybe we should have more farmers markets. Maybe we should have more community-supported agriculture, exactly the kind of thing that Carl already envisioned, you know, a couple of decades ago. And we now have, there was an article in the New York Times just this last week called Rooting the Unrooted. And it's about women from countries like Somalia who are coming to the United States to live in resource-poor areas, some of them rural communities, where they are bringing their skills as farmers to our community to raise fresh fruits and vegetables, etc., for people in their community, and how this is revitalizing the community. So Richard Heinberg is saying that what we're going to see in the future now is what he calls the re-ruralification of America. Now, I have to tell you that makes me pretty excited because, you know, all of the values that many of us have been a part of and that Carl shared with us and articulated for us could now actually become the reality for our grandchildren and for our children. And when you think about it, now you don't have to, have an office in a big city in order to do what you want to do. Given the new technology that we have, like my daughter, who runs her company from inside her home right here in Windsor, North Dakota. That's becoming the standard more and more. We don't need to be in these large urban communities. And Richard Heinberg is saying, in fact, that the first communities that are going to collapse now as we move in our future are suburban communities, because you're not going to be able to live in this suburban enclave and then travel 40, 50 miles to work every day when as energy costs go up. So you're going to see more and more people wanting to take their families, move to places like North Dakota, where they can raise some of their own food. Maybe where we're going to begin to see people living together in communities, sharing the kinds of resources, putting the community's needs first, because it's going to be the best way to meet their own needs. I think that's a real possibility now. Now maybe that sounds a little weird to some of you if you haven't thought about this before, but think about it. And I think it's part of that great gift that Carl gave us. And I want to share with you, because I think this quote from Carl that he made is also very similar to one that Wendell Berry has in one of his writings. And Wendell kind of spells it out a little bit more. And here's what Wendell Berry wrote. He said, "I believe that the community, in the fullest sense, a place and all its creatures, is the smallest unit of health." Think about this now. The community, in the fullest sense, a place with all its creatures, not just us humans, but all the creatures in that community, is the smallest unit of health. And that to speak of the health of an isolated individual is a contradiction in terms. And that's exactly the sense that Carl was expressing in his quote. An isolated individual, to speak of health, and health, of course, meaning not just our physical health, but our mental health, our spiritual health. To speak of health as an isolated individual is a contradiction in terms. It's the community that makes it all work and that gives value and meaning to our lives. And I think as we see the re-ruralification of America, you're going to see the real quality of life that people actually want. Because one of the other things that we know now is our material wealth has increased so rapidly since 1970 with this economies of scale concept. All of the indicators of the well-being, our well-being, have actually gone down. Our rates of depression are higher, our rates of suicide are higher as a society. It's that well-being which we've missed because we've been on this trajectory of we gotta get more material wealth in order to have quality of life, and we don't. The quality of life has escaped us. So we have an opportunity now, and I think rural communities and organizations like farms can take the leadership in helping us to understand what a real quality of life is and how we can re-embed that in our community here as the re-ruralification of America takes place. And we're going to see Medina be a thriving community by 2040 and certainly by 2050. And a few of us will still be around for that.